Well, our first question is, what is your understanding of Indigenous child welfare policies and protocols before COVID-19 pandemic?
In the Australian context, we already had issues of, I suppose, overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in child welfare context. So it was already an issue. Working within the academy around issues of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, the removal of children from families is something that is addressed frequently in understanding health and well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and connected to family. So we speak about the policies regularly. Also work for the Australian government in health and in rural and remote regions of Australia. And so it's an issue that gets raised often. So I'm not in the system as a worker, but I'm very aware of the policies that impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in this country.
What are the Indigenous child welfare policies and protocols during and after COVID-19 pandemic?
So prior to COVID, there were still a number of policies that impacted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. COVID really meant that it was actually escalated. We saw, because of restrictions and that with regards to family movements and depending on where people lived, that there was an escalation of the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the welfare system because of changes to circumstances of carers or family due to COVID. So it meant that we actually had a spike of instances where reports to child welfare or Department of Community Welfare was increased. And I don't know how to say this without sounding really bad, but it was based in racism. It was based in, people's perception of what family units should look like or how family units should operate. And I think that was a challenge for lots of people who had more time to be a little more nosy into people's affairs, that all of a sudden they had time, so they were paying attention to, issues that weren't normally on their radar. So we had an increase in, people reporting and that, which really changed for some families, their family dynamics in a really negative way.
Settlers were defining on what child welfare would look like and who can and can keep their children.
They weren't defining, but the system was. The system that, depending on what state and territory you are too, there's, it is governed by the state and territories and not, an overarching governmental. So, Australia has a similar system from what I understand of the federal government and then state and territory and then local jurisdictions. So it's trying to work out where were levers being pushed to enact, I suppose, some of the policies. So, sometimes it would be people would call the police first, and then the police have a duty of contacting child welfare services, which then meant people were being inserted into the system probably unnecessarily, because prior to COVID, the hypervigilance of people's movements and things like that meant that, you know, people were really looking and seeing things that they just probably hadn't recognized before. And so once it was from the police and then in the system, you know, there was obviously heightened engagement by the welfare system on families, which then meant, you know, the caseloads actually increased, which, you know, also meant that some of the systems actually escalated what may not have once been, you know, priority cases.
How does your country consult with the international declarations such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Convention on the Rights of the Child?
Whilst Australia is a signatory to them now, they haven't always been. So, you know, the UNDRIP was not something that Australia initially signed up for. We do now have, through those mechanisms, you know, greater representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in positions that does mean that there are voices. There are people in the system that escalate issues that mean that we don't use those mechanisms, so the UNDRIP and the rights of children, in a way that they could be used, because there are people who don't genuinely believe that they are things that, you know, why do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Nations Indigenous people have, you know, any greater rights or that to anybody else? So it doesn't make any difference. So I think most people wouldn't even know that there is the UNDRIP, and that there is, you know, the rights of children globally, from, you know, the United Nations point of view. They aren't able to elevate their sightlines from their own environment. As I said, you know, this country, though, we have a social justice commissioner who is Aboriginal, but again, you know, and does amazing work, but it's still up against a system that is challenged. And, you know, most of the political players are still from a particular era, just prior to the pandemic. You know, the Special Rapporteur also found that Australia still wasn't living up to its, you know, obligations under the UN Declaration for UNDRIP, and so we are still challenged in having those international mechanisms recognised as a central lever in this country.
And I was just thinking, as you were talking about that, do you think the universities there are doing the work to help that transformative for policies? Yeah. Or are they meeting resistance?
They're doing work, you know, they are doing work. In the last, you know, 10 years, Universities Australia, who is sort of the overarching academy for the universities, has put in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy that talks about, obviously, a number of things, but one of them is having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the academy as staff and increasing the number of students. And we can only do that when we make a safe environment that recognises culture as a central part of the individual. So there are, but again, it's still left to the passionate, it's still left to, you know, the minority. In health, though, we are seeing a number of professions start to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives in their courses through their accreditation processes. So your course won't become accredited unless you can demonstrate that you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and putting that into the curriculum, but that's not everywhere and it's not every profession. Some universities are ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content is being taught in the curriculum, but not all. And some universities do have it as a graduate attribute or a graduate outcome for students graduating from their institution around First Nations or Indigenous working respectfully and collaboratively.